A lot of people are wondering right now how, in this day and age, deflation is even a remote possibility. We see prices of food and energy rising ridiculous amounts in the space of just 1 year. We've seen costs of shipping skyrocketing every week with no end in sight. We see supply shortages in pretty much every industry, from electronics and vehicles to fresh fruit and toilet paper. It's not easy to see how deflation is even a distant possibility right now, but there is one thing that could lead to a monumental deflationary crash, and that is the greatest deleveraging event in history. Now, it's not exactly news at this point, but debt, leverage and margin are at all-time highs in pretty much every country in the world. From the US and Europe to China as well, we are more indebted than ever, and it's becoming a bit of a problem. Now, you might think that I'm just talking about us, me and you, the people that make up these countries, but even our governments are more indebted than ever before, and it's getting worse by the day. The levels of debt in our economies is accelerating, but it can't go on forever. At some point, it will reverse course, and we will see the greatest deleveraging event in history, and it will change the world we live in. These debt-fueled economies have led to GDP to debt figures not seen since the Second World War. Soaring asset prices that are out of control, ridiculous markets for speculation on investments like watches or cars, and a housing market that is out of reach for the vast majority of people. Today in this video, we're going to go through and look at how all this leverage supports itself, the positive feedback loops that will bring it all crashing down, and how this could lead to deflation the likes of which we've never seen before. But really quickly, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe. If you like this content, make sure to like the video and leave a comment for the algorithm. Also check out our Patreon, where you can join our exclusive investors community, gain access to loads of private content and support the channel. So what is leverage, what is debt, and what is margin? Well, very simply, leverage is just something that has a greater impact than it should according to its nominal value. Now, you use leverage when you're using a spanner or a wrench, but in financial terms, leverage allows you to increase your exposure to something without having to increase your capital. Margin is debt taken out in relation to a financial instrument, usually stocks or shares. If you trade on margin, it means you're taking out debt based on some financial assets, and you're using that debt to trade or invest in some more financial assets. Now, as that increases your exposure to something, that's obviously a form of leverage, because it allows you to buy more stocks or crypto than you otherwise would have been able to. Debt, on the other hand, is a little bit more obvious. It's debt, it's a loan or a liability. In financial terms, it's pretty much the same. It can be margin or even a mortgage. When we talk about it in terms of the markets, it's usually just a catch-all term for things like margin or mortgages, but it also represents much more. Now, if we're trying to evaluate the levels of debt in a system, then you might need to consider credit card debt or personal loans from family as well, things that aren't quite as obvious. I personally know a fair few people who have taken out personal loans or borrowed money from friends or family, or literally just used their credit cards to invest in things like options, stocks, or even crypto. Now, that isn't the most obvious form of debt, but it does contribute to how leveraged up a system is, even if it isn't very visible. Now, what about financial derivatives? Well, derivatives like futures or options contracts are basically artificial assets based on a financial asset. Futures are just contracts to buy or sell something at a certain price at a certain point in the future. Options are just contracts that give you the option but not the obligation to buy something at a certain price at a certain point in the future. The reason these contribute to the leverage in a system is because they represent huge amounts of money or capital without a lot of upfront costs. Basically, they allow you to increase your exposure to something without having to spend more while increasing your risk tolerance. They are leverage. Now, all of these instruments, which combine to make up the catch-all term of debt or liabilities or leverage, are really just a form of spending now, what you will have in the future. It's easiest to understand this in terms of credit cards. If you spend $5,000 on your credit card now, well, you're going to have to pay it back in the future at some point. Now, while it does need to be paid back in the future, it does also contribute to our economy now, boosting growth and boosting incomes and spending. But because it needs to be paid back in the future at some point, it will detract from growth or consumer spending or incomes then. This is unless the levels of debt just continue to build up and up as they have over the last few decades. While a lot of people feel like they never actually need to pay off their credit cards, they just need to keep making the minimum payments, at some point they will have to deliver and pay off their debts. And when they do, they will stop contributing to the economy. They will stop spending money to make up for all the extra stuff that they spent money on in the past. So why is the prospect of deleveraging increasing the likelihood of deflation? Well, first we have to understand that the term inflation sort of has two meanings depending on who you ask. Most people will tell you that it is the erosion of your purchasing power. It is when goods or services increase in price or when your currency decreases in value. And that is usually what we mean when we talk about inflation, and it's certainly what we mean when we listen to the Fed talk about inflation in terms of CPI or PCE. The real meaning of inflation is an increase in the monetary supply, or the inflating, the enlarging of the money supply. It then follows that deflation can either be when your currency increases in value and you get more for your dollars, or it can be when the number of dollars around physically decreases in quantity. Now, as leverage is a way of pulling purchasing power from the future into the present, and because of fractional reserve banking, leverage actually increases the money supply and contributes to inflation. Now, if I lent a friend $1,000, then while he has $1,000 to spend, I would have lost $1,000 to spend. So the total money in circulation wouldn't have actually changed and no inflation would have taken place. But because of fractional reserve banking, when you get a loan from a bank, they don't actually have to have the money and hand it over to you. They basically create the money out of thin air and then hand it to you, thus increasing the quantity of money in circulation and inflating the currency. When you pay that loan off, you are decreasing the quantity of currency in circulation, so you are deflating the currency. So what do these realities mean for us? Well, it means that when deleveraging starts, it will create a positive feedback loop that will cause the financial system to continue to fall. If we think back to 2008, where individuals couldn't afford their mortgages anymore, so they sold their houses and to pay off their loans, but as the average home price had been falling, maybe they couldn't afford to pay it all off. They defaulted on their debt and suddenly the burden was on the loan giver instead of the loan receiver. Now you might say that that isn't a problem, but in reality it doesn't matter if the money is removed from the system by someone taking out a loan or by someone giving the loan. The end result is the same. There are now companies or other people who have to either pay off their debts or default on their liabilities, so we see more deleveraging. We end up with a domino effect where it keeps getting worse and worse. People suddenly lose their credit cards and they are unable to spend as much as they used to, so the businesses they frequent start to struggle. Maybe they even lay off some of their workers, which creates a problem for the businesses that those employees frequent. Now this is obviously bad news and it would lead to a lot of financial ruin and pain and suffering for an awful lot of people, just like any other recession. But unfortunately, the alternative isn't much better either, and it is probably a little bit more likely. Now the alternative is deleveraging via inflation instead of deflation. Basically, as wages rise and prices rise with them, debt shrinks in comparison to everything else in the system. If you used to earn $50,000 a year and had $50,000 of debt, but a year later, thanks to inflation at 10%, you can now earn $55,000, well, your debt as a proportion of your salary has decreased. This is also a form of deleveraging, and it would also contribute to solving the debt money problem in our economies today. Unfortunately, high inflation has its own problems and they are no less damaging than deflation. And with inflation sitting at a minimum of 5% a year in the US and most other Western nations as well, and with the way supply side shocks seem to be getting worse, not better, and the way central banks are still continuing to print money, it seems like inflation is probably the route we are going to end up walking down. If you're new here, then consider checking out our Patreon. We're building a community of investors where we can talk and discuss all kinds of ideas just like we do on this channel. You also get access to loads of exclusive content that isn't available anywhere else, early access to all videos, private live streams, and buy and sell alerts for my personal portfolio, and you can help support the channel for as little as $1 a month. On top of all that, once we reach 100 patrons, I'm going to hire a full-time video editor to help me put out even more content just like this. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure to subscribe. If you want to help spread the word, then consider liking the video and leaving a comment, and YouTube will do its part by pushing this video out to more people just like you. I really do appreciate all the support you give the channel, even if it's just leaving a like. There's also a link to my other channel down below in the description you can check out as well. In the description, there's a link to my favorite brokerage called eToro, where you can trade stocks and shares, crypto, commodities, foreign currencies, and more, all for 0% commission. And there's also a link down below in the description to BLOCKFI, where you can get up to $250 in free Bitcoin, and you can earn interest on whatever crypto you hold, whether it's Bitcoin, Ether, or even stable coins. You can earn as much as 8% interest a year. Stay stoic. Thanks for watching. Until next time.